Can I first, before you pivot, say something?
Go for it.
I mean, having said to you what I think your concern is with Jordan, I mean, it strikes me that Jordan's concern, and I share this, just as I share some of your concern that we expressed at the outset. And Jordan's fundamental concern, it seems to me, is one I fundamentally share, which is rationalism isn't enough. And it's, or let me put it another way.
Okay, but then the two of you, can you both show me where it's obviously insufficient? Like
music.
But there's nothing. But again, so to say that it's not, to say that there's more to life than being rational, is not to say, and perhaps never to say, you need to run against rationality. You need to be irrational in order to get something good.
Let me express it a different way.
Yeah.
We haven't tried the purely rational approach yet, or we haven't tried it for very long.
Well, many of us have been trying for a couple of centuries at least.
Which is a blip.
Yeah.
I mean, the tiniest dot at the end of human evolution. So I think that a concern which Jordan has, and certainly a concern I have, is if we try this, we can think of all sorts of ways in which it can go wrong. If you take away all that supporting structure, you can think of any number of ways in which it can go wrong. And that I suppose that's at the root of the concern about where you might be taking us. Or to put it another way, if we enter the world that you would suggest, not everyone may necessarily come out as Sam Harris.
Well, give me one way where you think it can go wrong. And again, we can't forget your caveat, which you started with.
What if you're not very smart?
Right. Well,
no,
so
I don't mean.
So then you're basically saying that the stupid people need their myths. You know, we smart people on stage don't need them.
Right.
But
well, I actually am saying that to some degree. Look, if you're not exceptionally cognitively astute, you should be traditional and conservative. Because if you can't think well, you're going to think badly. And if you think badly, you're going to fall into trouble. And so it is definitely the case, and this has been what would you call a cliche of political belief for a long time. If you're not very smart, it's better to be conservative, because then you do what everyone else does. And generally speaking, doing what everyone else does is the path of least error moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that rationality is unnecessary.
Nor does it mean that all conservatives are stupid.
It doesn't mean that either. Right, precisely. It doesn't mean that either.
Very important caveat.
Yes,
but all conservative structures are not the same either, and that we have many warring and incompatible versions of being conservative.
True. And this is where rationality actually does play its role. Although I don't think it's best conceptualized as rationality precisely, it's definitely the case that to take Douglas's point, that we need to be bound by our traditions, but we need to be judicious in their re-representation and update, and we have to do both.
This is what, in the dialogue on religion, this is what Schopenhauer says. He describes the tragedy of the clergy.
Yeah.
He pretty much says, look, if they don't believe it, they recognize it's a very useful metaphor, but they don't need to believe it. They tell it, and he says the tragedy of the clergy is they can never admit that what they're saying is just a metaphor.
Right. Is this before or after he threw his housekeeper down the stairs?
Look, we can all find flaws.
We all have skeletons in our closet. Yeah.
But yes, there is a way in which religion is what he describes as philosophy for the masses. And that if you recognize that most people are not going to spend their lives studying philosophy, they're not going to be reading about the differences between Leibniz and Kant, that religion has to do. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that particularly, but there's a heck of an argument within there, which a lot of people will be living their lives in.
I don't think it's a good argument if you recall or just imagine what it's like to be a child, especially from the perspective of being a parent. I have two young girls, and they're very smart young girls. I mean, they're smart, but one of them's 4.5 years old and knows almost nothing, right? So she knows what I and my wife and our society tell her at some level. I mean, at what point is she going to think for herself about these fundamental questions? And I mean, she's currently spending half the day dressed up like Batgirl or Catwoman, right? So if I told her that these superheroes were real, she would believe that for the longest time. And if we lived in a cult that thought they were real, or a whole society that by dint of its geographic or linguistic isolation managed to maintain a conversation about, in this case, Batgirl and Catwoman, that they were real and that it was absolutely important to honor them, and you'd burn in hell if you failed to do this. Well, we would be meeting fully grown adults who believe this sort of thing.
But it seems to me, Sam, that you bring up the superhero thing quite a bit, so I think I'll go after that directly.
Yeah.
So
then I want.
I love superheroes.
Okay, so you make the case in A Moral Landscape that an ideal is real. Because the ideal that you define an ideal is real, and the ideal is whatever maximizes well-being and gets us away from hell. You said not only is that real, you also say that's the fundamental axiom. That's the claim in The Moral Landscape. So you do make a claim that there is a real ideal. And I would say...
I wouldn't necessarily put it that way, but we are in a circumstance where things can matter, right? Consciousness is the condition in which things can matter, where there can be a range of experiences, some of which are very, very bad. If the word bad means anything, they're bad. And some of which are very, very good, if the word good means anything. And we are navigating in that space. We can't help but navigate or seek to navigate in that space.
Right, absolutely.
And religion is one form of conversation about that navigation problem. And I would argue
let's go back to the ideal.
Often diluted one.
Well, like Jordan rolls his sleeves up.
Batgirl.
He means business now.
Batgirl. Batgirl and Catwoman are approximations to a higher ideal. That's what they are.
Well, and to return to this with a biblical idea, I'm fairly sure from personal experience that a lot of parents are perfectly content with bringing their children up vaguely within the story they've inherited. And at some point, the children realize that the fairy doesn't bring them money when their teeth fall out. And at some point, maybe around the same time or a bit later, they discover that Santa Claus doesn't really come down the chimney. And at some point, they realize that actually the whole religious thing is a kind of metaphor, but it's got them through the formative years in some way. Often with terrible damage along the way, I concede that. But also with something else. And I'm struck by the number of people, and this is why I share some of what I think is Jordan's concern about the possibility of the world you're envisaging, which is, I can think of a lot of parents now, in my country and other countries as well, who I'm just very struck. They themselves are kind of baby boomer or 60s atheists, humanists, whatever. And I start to notice, for instance, that they're enrolling their children in Christian schools. And I say to them, why are you doing this? And they have fairly coherent arguments along the lines of the one I've just had. Look, I don't particularly believe this myself, but I think it's a pretty good way to bring up the kids. It's a structure of a kind. And I'm not sure, I can find all sorts of flaws in that. But enough people are doing it that it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, well, I would say yes. It speaks to a real failure of imagination and effort in the secular community to produce truly non-embarrassing alternatives.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this is across the board. This is not just school. This is how do you conduct a funeral? How do you get married? You know, all of the what rites of passage can you offer a 13-year-old?
What are you doing here? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Just to be the first people in history to have absolutely no explanation for what we're doing at all.
Yeah.
Is a big moment.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's the.
That sharpens up my concern perfectly, because to shrink back from that moment and resort to one of the pseudo stories of the past, I consider to be a failure of nerve, both intellectually and morally.
So let's go back to the superhero idea. One of the things you might notice about superheroes is that some of them are actually deities, right? So in the Marvel pantheon, you have Thor, for example, and so there's a very thin line between the idea of a superhero and the idea of a god, especially if you think about it in a polytheistic manner. So the modern superheroes and the Greek gods, for example, share a tremendous number of features in common. And so here's something to think about. So there's a reason that people admire superheroes, and it's because they act out parts of the hero archetype. That's the technical reason. They're obviously acting something out because that's how you can tell they're superheroes. They share some set of characteristics across the set of superheroes that makes them superheroes. Now the question might be, what is the essential element of being a superhero that makes you a superhero? And the answer, the way that that was solved historically, is that as polytheistic societies developed, and that was usually a consequence of isolated tribes coming into contact with one another, they each had their separate deities. And then over the course of time, those deities warred in actual wars with people, but also conceptually. And out of that polytheistic framework was extracted something that was vaguely monotheistic, as all of those cultures came together to try to determine what their highest ideal should be. So that's the God of gods, that's a way of thinking about it, or the King of kings, that's another way of thinking about it. And that's an implicit ideal. Well, and you could make the case that there's nothing more...
Tell that to the Hindus. You tell that to the Hindus. I mean, we've got 1.2 billion people, or maybe it's 1.4 now, who are operating in a religiously saturated system that does not conform to that ideal. There is no one on top of it all.
Well, they're still associated in a
arguably, there's three on top of it all, but...
Well, there's still an attempt to generate that polytheistic, to integrate that polytheistic reality underneath a single rubric, or you have nothing but continual dissociation of the culture. And I'm not saying this is necessary.
That's a pretty good description of what's going on in India at the moment.
Well, I'm not saying that this is inevitable either. And there is a tension. The problem, this is Nietzsche's observation, and Mircea Eliade as well. The problem with extracting out the highest God from the panoply of gods is the ideal becomes so abstract that it disappears. That's the death of God. And Eliade has tracked that phenomena over multiple cultures. It's not something that's unique to the West. So the danger of that abstraction is that it gets too abstract and disappears and leaves us in the situation that Douglas just pointed out.
Can I throw us back to the key, the key issue of Elton John's glass, which you came up with the other night? Because there's something I wanted to add to that. If perhaps you'd explain why I said Elton John's glass just now.
Well, it came back to this question of what makes something valuable, and I used as an example in Vancouver on one of those nights. If I had a glass here, which I said was actually it was the glass that Elton John used the last time he played in this theater, suddenly it seems to be a more valuable glass. And then Jordan and I argued about just what the status of that value was. I don't know where you want to take this, but yeah.
Well, it's just one thing in particular, which is that the whole issue of what it is you give value to, and let's say that glass was demonstrated for a time to having been drunk from by Elton John at his final concert or his latest farewell tour, whatever.
Yes.
So that's already a glass with some meaning. Let's say that over the years the whole attribution of that glass becomes debatable. Over a long period of time, a lot of things are going to have happened around it, and to stretch this to breaking point possibly, let's say at some point people lose their lives over whether that is Elton John's glass or not. Well, let's say that people start to lose blood.
Let's not just say that. Let's recognize that is the world we're living in with respect to other religions.
So the problem is that we end up, when we're talking about religion, it's the same thing when you're talking about land. You're not just talking about any inherent worth. You're talking also about the worth of things people have given up for this.
Yeah.
And so we end up giving the layers of things. Well, no, it's more than that. We inherit more and more layers of the meaning because other people before us have given that meaning to it. So that by the time you have this object, it's an object of worth, even if it's of no worth in itself at all, but because of the amount of worth that people before you have given to it. And that seems to some extent what we're doing with the religion discussion.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so that's extraordinarily productive, I think. So, see, when you start with the hypothesis of facts, then you kind of have to define what a fact is. And so I think the simplest way of doing that to begin with is that there's a set of objective facts, and that's the facts about objective reality. You can think about that from a scientific perspective. And we're going to agree that that exists, although it's very complicated and difficult to understand. That exists as one set of constraints on what we can do and what we can't do. That's the objective world. And then on top of that, and this is where things get very, very complicated, you have this layered system of meaning, which is partly a manifestation of these layers of the nervous system that I described, but also partly a manifestation of those layers of the nervous system operating in social space over vast periods of time. So that would be the sociological agreement. That's all layered on top of the objective world, and it actually constitutes part of the lens through which you view the world, to the degree where you actually see the layering in the thing. So like when you go to a museum and you look at Elvis Presley's guitar, you don't look at the guitar and think that's Elvis Presley's guitar. That's not how your brain works. You actually see Elvis Presley's guitar. It's an act of perception, so it becomes built right into your nervous system. Even though the fact that that is Elvis Presley's guitar, and the reason that that's valuable is because of a sociological agreement about what position Elvis Presley occupied in the dominance hierarchy that we're all part of. And so what you see when you look at an artifact like that is you see a layer of dominance hierarchy overlaid on top of an objective reality. And that's actually your phenomenal reality. Now, the thing that's so interesting is that that layer of perception that's mediating between the facts and you has a structure. And that's the structure that I've been insisting is a narrative. And I think Sam thinks it's a narrative too, because his fundamental ethic is that you should act in a way which means to embody a mode of being, which means to be a personality that moves us from hell to something approximating heaven.
Okay, but Jordan, what I'm struggling to understand, what I don't understand is how any of that is a counterpoint to my concern about religion. So because I agree with all that. I mean, there are some caveats I would issue. For instance, it's quite possible to walk into a museum, be shown a guitar, not know it's Elvis Presley's guitar, and then be told it's Elvis Presley's guitar, and you can see in real time the change in significance. So that you can see the layers of the perceptual, the meaning accrue. You might actually not even, you might know who Elvis Presley is and not care, right? So there are many different things on the menu here, as opposed to just beholding awestruck Elvis Presley's guitar.
Sam,
and the same is true of the Jesus story or anything else that people, you can find layers of engagement with it that may be more and less useful.
Yes.
My fundamental concern is that the way you are tending to dignify the religious subset of stories as being foundational, necessary, we criticize at our peril, is giving people license to believe things that they clearly shouldn't believe, things that are intrinsically divisive, intrinsically less than optimal as far as organizing an individual human life. We can do better than Christianity on almost every question, but with the possible exception of building churches.
Okay, so
right?
the first thing is that I deeply agree with you that that mechanism can go wrong. Okay, so you have the objective world, and it's one set of constraints, and then you have this interpretive structure. And I'm not saying that that interpretive structure is infallible. It clearly isn't, and neither is the process that gives rise to it. You see this, for example, in conditions like manic depressive disorder with religious delusions or schizophrenia. You see what you see in those situations is a pathologization of that overlay of meaning. That can clearly happen.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now the question is, what do we do about that? How do we keep those perceptual structures, which are somewhat arbitrary, how do we keep them functional? And this is, I think, where your discussion of rationality is so important, particularly when you say rationality is what enables us to establish what we agree on in our shared reality. Okay, so imagine this. So part of the way you orient yourself in the world of facts, objective facts, is through your senses. So you basically have 5 dimensions of triangulation, so to speak, to help you determine what's there in the objective world. And then you have this multi-layer structure that's partly biological and partly socio-cultural that enables you to distill that, but it can go astray, partly because it ages and becomes archaic, which is, and demented for that matter, which is partly your objection to the fundamentalist types. This has been known for a very long time that this sort of thing happens. So what we do, the way we solve that, we have a solution to that. So partly the way we solve that is through articulated discourse. Right? Because you have a way of looking at the world, and I have a way of looking at the world, and we have to occupy the same space. So you're probably wrong about some things, and I'm probably wrong about some things, and hopefully if we talk, we can sort out the differences and make things more stable.
Right.
So,
and I would put rationality right in that place.
right,
That's why rationality is primary.
But the problem, fair enough, but there's a problem with that too. And I think, see, all the times we've talked so far, you've been, I would say, the avatar of a scientific viewpoint, and I've been cast, let's say, as the avatar of a religious viewpoint. But I've actually thought this through scientifically a lot. And I can make a biological argument for all of this, and a developmental argument. So it isn't only rationality that does this. So this is the thing that was so cool about studying, for example, Jean Piaget. Because one of the things Piaget pointed out is that children engage in negotiation. They negotiate their reality just like adults do. But they don't do it only through articulated speech, and neither do adults. What children do is they get together and play. And this is why play is so important for children. That starts to happen when they're about 3 years old, because they can look outside their own idiosyncratic perspective at 3, and they can start to take someone else's viewpoint into consideration, which is what you have to do if you're going to play. And then what children do is they invent little fictional realities. That's what they do when they're pretending. And so they assign each other roles, and they assign a plot and a drama to the pretend play, and then they act it out. And in that action, they bring themselves into harmonious union, right? Which is the act of generating a game that everyone wants to play. And Piaget's observation was, and this is Nietzschean observation as well, that the morality that characterizes society isn't rationality top down, although it's partly that. It's also interactions that are, say, play-based and bottom up. And that's actually how it evolved to begin with, because animals generate societies that are functional, but they don't do it through rationality. They can't, because they don't have rationality. They don't have articulated speech. They have something like an embodied game. Now what happens, and this is a Nietzschean observation, he's the first person I learned this from, is our morality emerged from the bottom up through thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of shared games, let's say, and the interweaving of those shared games into something approximating a morality that we could all live within peacefully. That happened bottom up. And then what happened was, because we didn't know the mechanism behind that, because it's instantiated in our nervous system invisibly, we watched ourselves act, which is what we do, and then we told stories about that, because that's what we do when we watch ourselves act. And then we encapsulated the morality that evolved in the stories. And that's the religious essence of the story.
I got 10 seconds. So we have to pivot to Douglas for an important question, but I would just say in response to that, Jordan, I don't disagree with much of consequence in that. My concern, however, is that there's a reason why we differentiate childhood from adulthood, and all of us are stunted to some degree or another in a fairly perverse childhood. And the reason, I mean, what we confront now is a world largely populated by dangerous children, right, who are in their 5th and 6th decade of life.
You mean run by?
Populated and run by, yes. And if anything typifies the childhood of our species, in my view, it is religious orthodoxy. And insofar as we're breaking free of the orthodoxy part and getting something that's more scalable and can survive a more pluralistic and cosmopolitan world, it is because it is being winnowed at every point by rationality. And I think that at some point we could have a fully defensible, rational honoring of many of the things you think are essential, like the power of story, or the power of ritual, or the power of art that is focused on some sacred purpose. And the question is how to get there.